It turns out that the third-person action game before Gears of War and Uncharted had a lot more in common with what we now refer to as boomer shooters than I once thought. They both focus on speed, item hunting, and circle strafing, with level design that ranges from a linear corridor romp to sprawling environments on the border of confusion. On a side note, the Sega Dreamcast sure was weird, right? It came out during the 5th console generation, yet had technical specifications closer to the PS2. There's a reason why games on this system always had a very distinct look compared to anything else around at the time. You were essentially looking at N64 graphics with filtered PS1 textures and PC sound quality and view distances. It's those very qualities that made the Dreamcast a prime candidate for ports of arcade and PC titles. With that said, Slave Zero was released for both Dreamcast and PC in late 1999, only to go into sleep mode for nearly 25 years. Then, out of nowhere, Ziggurat Interactive, who now own the IP, published Slave Zero X and Episode Enio, both of which have nothing in common with the original gameplay-wise, but are considered part of the official canon. The plot is exactly what you would expect from a late 90s sci-fi game. It's the year 2499 and the entire world has become Japan. It's your typical resistance versus big corporation type plot, where you control what's called a slave unit, and your mission is to stop the bad guys from growing more of them to create a super weapon. Yes, I said growing, not building, since the slave units are apparently raised from these cybernetically infused embryos. The plot itself isn't anything too elaborate, although I do commend the writers for putting a spin on the giant peacekeeping robot cliche. Besides the gameplay, Slave Zero's second strongest asset is everything around the story. You're going to be exploring a distinctly video gamey depiction of a futuristic industrialized world with skyscrapers, suspended highways, oddly spacious sewers, and lots of facilities. Neon billboards and signs are plastered everywhere. You can see little cars driving around and even tiny little people, all of which reminds you that you're not meant to take this too seriously. The setting of a concrete jungle has always appealed to me, and while it doesn't necessarily have to be set in Japan, there's just something about the design of the roads, distance between buildings, and overall visual language that just looks cooler than something like New York. It's the kind of place that is anything but uncommon in any form of media, but I seldom find it within the games I particularly enjoy. Before you point me towards the hundreds of other games that are set in a Neo-Tokyo type universe, it really isn't just down to the theming, but how the theme is executed. There's an oddly specific cool factor to urban environments being depicted via late 90s models and textures. It's almost like the good version of the Uncanny Valley, where things look almost real since it doesn't exactly take millions of polys to make a building, yet there's just something a tiny bit off that somehow gives it the same vibe as, for example, mid-1900s future vision type illustrations. Will the future have MIP mapping in real life? Will buildings just vanish into nothing if you look at them from above? Who knows, it ain't the year 2499 just yet. That's all to say that Slave Zero wasn't the most impressive game on the system, both in terms of graphics and also sound. There's a few standout effects, like when you pick up a health item, and the voice acting is quite a bit better than what you might expect from a low-profile game of the time.
It's just the first slave, and seemed quite sufficient to drive off an elite regiment of sentinels.
While the Dreamcast version doesn't have any music for some reason, the soundtrack you would hear on PC is exactly what you would expect. Drum and bass and some industrial metal riffs. Even without the music, I still feel that the environments still have a very strong sense of presence thanks to the varied texture work and lighting. Slave Zero offers an addicting loop of third-person combat, scrounging for items and taking down bosses. On the rare occasion you'll have an escort or defense mission, but don't worry, there's only one escort mission and the boats you have to protect can take quite a bit of punishment, and the few times you have to defend the plot-important object only require you to do so for about 30 seconds, after which you're left to deal with the remaining enemies. The overall pacing of the combat encounters has an interesting dichotomy between typical run-and-gun type design where you just encounter enemies as you go, rarely actually being required to kill them to progress, and these Serious Sam moments where you're locked in and have to take out a select number of enemies to open a door or something. And speaking of, the enemy variety is quite impressive, all things considered. Some are nimble and go down easy, others are large masses of metal that take a beating. You've also got the obligatory spider enemies, and these guys with the shields that are as exploitable as they are irritating. Thanks to this variety in enemy speed, size, and general tactics, you're never left relying on just one kind of weapon the whole game. While there's a decent number of different weapons, you'll only have 3 equipped at any given time: a primary, a secondary, and a rocket launcher. Each of these can be upgraded and swapped out for different ones as the game goes on, and as you face bigger threats, you'll have no choice but to think about how much ammo you can afford to use for each one, because some enemies are particularly weak to one of the free weapon types. Also, I swear, the developers intended for your rocket launcher to be your primary weapon because like 75% of the ammo you find is just more rockets. Lastly, in an out-of-character move for me, I have to admit that the bosses were a pleasant surprise in their execution. While they are simple to defeat, no two fights feel the same in the way that you have to reach the point of being able to damage them. Some are only exposed temporarily, others have environmental hazards, and just those slight variations on the typical shoot it till it dies format are enough to make what few bosses Slave Zero has stand out. Level design can often be the make or break of a game like this. There's a very fine line to walk between building a stage that keeps its goal clear without seeming shallow. Slave Zero miraculously walks that line with not a single level feeling like a misuse of a trope. Somehow even the sewer levels were enjoyable. I believe this game is able to make its stages flow so smoothly while still having a sense of believability to the design, thanks to how it combines straightforward hallways with the occasional out-of-the-way area that feels like discovering a hidden path, but is actually the way you're supposed to go. By sprinkling in just a couple of these aha moments, it makes you feel as if you're truly figuring your way through these unfamiliar places, even if the way forward is ultimately clear. Trust me, I'm the kind of guy to get lost in a linear FPS campaign, so the fact that even I needed no outside assistance for this game should tell you how well communicated the design is. This is enhanced with some small details that draw your eye to points of interest, like road signs with arrows on them or carefully placed light sources, and even the fact that doors will always lock behind you, preventing you from falling into the usual trap of backtracking in the hopes of finding something new that is obviously not there. But even if you do find yourself a little off the beaten path, you'll at least have no problem getting around. Slave Zero excels in the aspect that you would most expect a PC to console port with no second analog stick to fail: the controls. But I'll be damned, this game controls like a dream, regardless of your chosen input method. You're provided with several different control presets, but I found the default to be perfectly comfortable within just a few minutes of playing. It's essentially dual analog, but inverted. You move with the face buttons and aim with the stick. Now, full disclosure, I played through this version of the game on an emulator, where I pretty much just recreated a conventional PC shooter scheme, except with the arrow keys to replace the mouse, and unless you're playing this on authentic hardware and don't want to play the PC version, I recommend you do the same, or just map a controller accordingly. Truth is, even if such a workaround weren't possible, I still have to give Slave Zero credit for simply controlling extremely smoothly. Your movements feel just fast enough to get a move on, but not so fast that the later levels with bottomless pits become frustrating. Strafing feels great thanks to the visual feedback of your jet boosters and the way they light the environment around you, and even using a digital input method to emulate an analog stick, I found aiming to be very precise and leaps beyond many other console games I've played using a similar control method. Slave Zero's Dreamcast port is one of those bizarre instances where even when the performance tanks, the controls remain responsive, made even more puzzling seeing as there are games out there that feel unresponsive even when the frame rate is high. Regardless, while visually the game may not appear smooth, I can assure you that the control will never be a burden.
Manta Leader. Transmitting coordinates. Now.
So you've been in the campaign. What now? Well, aside from replaying the game on a higher difficulty, although even on easy things can get tough by the end, Multiplayer deathmatch is available. This mode forces the game into first person, which was always an option in single player, but it didn't really feel right for Slave Zero's gameplay style, although I understand why they force you to use it here since you only get half the screen real estate. I can imagine this being pretty fun with a friend, but let's be honest, if you're looking for a split-screen deathmatch game on the Dreamcast, you go with Quake 3 or Unreal Tournament. And if you're not partial to any one system, then GoldenEye's right there. Truth be told, there's not a lot of what you would conventionally consider to be replay value in Slave Zero's single-player campaign, primarily due to a lack of optional collectibles or the level of secret hunting you would find in a first-person shooter of the time. That hasn't stopped me from replaying most of it about 3 times since my first playthrough, and not just for the sake of getting footage. I simply find the core combat and movement mechanics intrinsically satisfying enough that repeat playthroughs just sort of happen naturally, and the aforementioned enemy and weapon variety really helps in keeping the loop fresh several missions in. Slave Zero is a fascinating example of less is more. It's got a fairly short single player with little in the way of extrinsic replay value and level design that is only a few steps removed from an on-rails shooter, and yet that restraint, be it intentional or the result of budgetary constraints, delivers a short but sweet experience that translates even on an objectively limited input device. When I play something like Call of Duty Finest Hour via PCSX2, it's out of curiosity, but when I play Slave Zero on Redream, it's a totally viable alternative. Of course, PC is still the way to go, and with this game being available on Steam and GOG with remarkable review scores, the chance remains that we might see another entry that revisits a style of third-person action that we haven't seen since the 7th generation.